If there's a word that does not make me feel super warm and fuzzy, especially around the holidays, it is prepare. Prepare, in my mind, really means a list of things to do, and that list seems to grow exponentially during the season. So this week, as I prepared for today's service, I found myself contemplating really what does it mean to prepare for the Lord for us here today. Because I don't know about you, but for me, preparing can be a little overwhelming. Maybe you might remember the first time that your parents came to visit. Maybe you had a new apartment. Maybe you had your first home that you set up with your spouse. Maybe it was your first parsonage, I don't know. But do you remember that frantic cleaning frenzy? Is there still a residue of that memory there? And, that white glove test that you felt needed to be passed regardless of your parents' standards, it doesn't matter. And that stress, right? Going into, suddenly the toothbrush is like cleaning the floorboards because you must prepare for that momentous visit. And it becomes, cleaning isn't just like this chore, it's suddenly like this all-out mission. And the meal. That first time that you had a big family meal that you hosted, that you prepared, whew, even if it was the most familiar dish, cooking took on that extra weight of anticipation. And maybe still today when you do it, you feel that weight of anticipation of wanting to share these gifts with people that you love, and you want to bring the very, very best. It has to be just right, and just so we must prepare. Or maybe you might remember what it was like to prepare for your exams. Some folks might have that in their more recent memory, and some folks might be living this through friends and family in our lives. And, those nights of staying up studying or scrambling to get papers done, the exhaustion, the stress, the loopiness that ensues, and the Starbucks, way too much coffee, the pizza, the chocolate that helps you prepare. Yeah, prepare. But again, I ask, what does it mean to prepare for the Lord? Friends, this week, as I followed the news of even more devastation and brutality across the country, I was challenged again to consider preparation. It's been another heavy week. My heart absolutely breaks at the news of a young boy who completed suicide in Northern California after being mercilessly bullied for being a cheerleader as a boy. Prepare. We're hearing reports of what one headline called, quote, absurd levels of police brutality in Cleveland, Ohio, after a Department of Justice study was released. And we'll remember the recent death in Cleveland of a 12-year-old boy, Tamir Rice, who was shot and killed when he was playing with a toy gun. Prepare the way. Friday night, a man was fatally shot in Hollywood on the same spot where protesters held a die-in in response to the news that the officer who caused the death of Eric Gardner would not be indicted despite video evidence that the chokehold was illegal. And so protesters went out, and on that same corner later that night, a man with a pocket knife, a white man with a pocket knife, was fatally shot. Whew. Prepare the way for the Lord, indeed. We heard this week also about a transgender woman who was shot in LA, and she was knocking on a door to ask for help. You may have also heard the story of homeless encampments that were destroyed to make way for more Silicon Valley housing in San Jose, and people's belongings and what they came to know as their homes being taken away. And elsewhere in the world, storms are brewing, superstorms are brewing, wars are being fought, Ebola continues to devastate countries in West Africa, even though it's not in the headlines here as much. Whew, prepare indeed. When the prophet Isaiah shared this word, He didn't know, obviously, how many different ways his words would end up applying, and that it would continue to speak to us centuries later as we too seek comfort from God, and we too seek reassurance that our trials, such as they may be, will one day be over, as we too are tasked with preparing the way. The prophecy was, well, originally, I guess, applied to the Hebrew people who had been in exile for so long and who were delivered from Babylon. And it was the message that they needed to hear after a long exile. It was a message of hope and of peace, and more than peace, shalom. And it brings the promise of restoration because God is and because God can. And years after, the book of Mark refers back to the same scripture from the prophet Isaiah, as John becomes that voice who cries in the wilderness, "Prepare the way for the Lord." You know what I'm going to ask, right? What does it mean to prepare the way for the Lord? See, when I think of a literal road, the road from Babylon maybe, I can think of the obstacles that might be there. We might find sandstorm has covered, part of the way. You've seen these if you've driven out to the desert, right? You might find boulders in the way, maybe some overturned Joshua trees. I don't know. I'm just imagining here. And when we think about our spiritual life, we can think of similar stumbling blocks. We can think of our pride, our perfectionism, our lack of forgiveness, our individualism, hardened hearts. I don't know, pick an obstacle. We have got them. And these are all the things that Jesus has to trip over on his way to embrace us in perfect love and mercy. And in our Advent study this morning, we were also reflecting on the fact that you don't just clear the path once. You have to continually keep maintaining this path. You don't just say, well, I am done with this. This boulder's moved. There will never be another obstacle. I will never need to wrestle with forgiveness again, ever, ever, ever. I'm done. I've arrived. Because we know that that's not how the world works. Not the world of physical things, not the world of the spirit either. And the thing is, it's not that Jesus can't overcome even the most obnoxious of our barriers, but really, the fewer bumps in the road, the smoother the journey is going to be. And because we travel together, in the words of liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, the following of Jesus is not along a private route, but is part of a collective enterprise. Our salvation, or we can call it our liberation, or we could call it our restoration. It's not an individual effort. It's a communal journey that we take. And so that preparation involves the personal reflection on our own obstacles in the context of community, where we can have accountability, where we can lean on each other, and where we can even, thanks be to God, disagree. And that, friends, is a beautiful thing and a sign of a healthy community. So it's not just about me. It's not just about a single one of us, because we're accountable and we're responsible and we're linked and tied to each other. So then, what does it mean to prepare the way of the Lord? I can see a few possibilities in our context, and I will offer them as just that, as possibilities. One way to prepare the way of the Lord is to make space in our own lives for God. Sometimes I wonder at the fact that God is still speaking, that God can still get a word in edgewise. It might be the biggest miracle I know, because we are so busy, and we are so scheduled, and we are so programmed, and we are so hyper-connected in some ways, and so isolated and lonely in others. Especially during this season, prepare the way for the Lord. Take time. I shared in your bulletin some copies of a wonderful little Advent calendar that was put together by the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference of the UCC. And I just really liked it because it has a series of daily suggestions that are as simple as pray for someone, pray specifically for someone who is not your favorite on December 18th. Doesn't take a huge chunk of time to do that. Share a meal with someone you love. That sounds like a wonderful way to spend some time, etc. So you can peruse these on your own, incorporate them to your spiritual practice however you might find helpful. I thought it was a fun way to kind of remember to kind of declutter my own practice and make time for these things. A good way to kind of refresh and reconnect. It's also a good time to prepare by being attentive to our prayer life and see if your prayer practice is in need of a little freshening up. Making time to be God is important to our lives, and Advent is a great time to do that. One of the questions that I often get, both in my role as pastor, pastoral caregiver, chaplain, is from folks who have hesitation about praying. Not sure how to pray, it feels uncomfortable, am I doing this right kind of questions. And I'll let you in on a professional secret. I learned this, in a very professional manner. There's no wrong way to pray. There's really no wrong way to pray. You don't need words, you don't need a specific place, you don't need a specific posture. If you are seeking to connect with God, glory be, whatever works for you. Some of us do walking prayers. That's why the tradition of walking a labyrinth, for example, was born. Prayer walks can be a wonderful way to pray for an entire neighborhood. As you walk, you are conscious of the presence of God with you, and you are praying as you go. Prayer partners are a fantastic thing to have. Just means someone with whom you connect around your intentions. And we did a little bit of that when we shared, you'll remember the fabric strips that were the waters. And we connected with someone whose intention we wanted to hold in prayer as well. So whatever it is that speaks to you, you can pray the psalm book. They were prayers and songs originally. So that can be a wonderful way when you aren't finding the words to go through and find a way to refresh and reconnect. And it's also okay to try a form of prayer and realize, I don't like this doesn't speak to me, this doesn't connect me to God. Discard it and try something new. So that's my encouragement for this, because what we don't want to do is to let all the noise and even the cheer crowd out the reason for the season, if I can be that cliche, which is the presence of Christ among us. And this is a time to be extra attentive to what's moving in us and how we are responding to that presence and growing into that presence. Another way to prepare the way of the Lord is to be involved in the world. It might seem like contradictory advice, right? I'm saying slow down, take time, and be engaged. But maybe it's less of a contradiction and more of a prioritizing and looking at where our energy is going and our time is going. Dietrich Bonhoeffer argued that, I quote, "The church is the church only when it exists for others." He believed that Christ is really present only in the community. The community is in him, and he is in the community. And so to prepare is to be an advocate for justice in whatever way makes sense to you and to your community. And it's less about agreeing on an issue and more about being engaged and being present to the world among us and to God's presence in the world. We can prepare the way of the Lord by following John's lead. Not necessarily the eating locust part. Not advocating for that. But, unless you think they're yummy, I'm not knocking it. But he was preparing the way by proclaiming God's coming. And he was preparing the world by baptizing and making the world a better place as people came to God and renounced the way of sin. And he was clear about one thing: he was not God, and he was not the Messiah. So he chastised the people who thought that he was a Messiah. He offered the baptism of water in preparation for Christ's coming. So similarly, we're tasked with doing what we can and what we feel called to do, ultimately knowing that God can do whatever we cannot. There's this story, it's like, I don't know, it's a motivational kind of story about a little girl who's walking on the seashore, and she sees all these estrellas de mar, help me out, stars. What are they called?
Starfish.
Starfish, yes, thank you. Okay, so she sees these starfish that have been washed up onto the shore and that are dying out of the water. So this guy sees her and she's going diligently. There's thousands of starfish washed to the shore, and she's diligently going, picking them up, putting them back in the water, picking it up, putting it back in the water. And this guy comes to her and asks, kid, what are you doing? Can't you see there's like thousands of these guys there? You can't save them all. It's not going to make a difference. And she says, well, it made a difference to this one. Right? So we can think of those starfish as we find those ways to engage and to prepare the way of the Lord. And we know that whatever we can't do, God is standing in that gap to do it. But that, yes, that doesn't let us off the hook to do the part that we're tasked with doing. Just because we can't fix it all, do it all, prepare it all, and bring perfect peace and shalom and all of that to the crazy world of ours, it doesn't mean we're off the hook. Because we prepare by doing what we can and by trusting and acting with the certainty that God does the rest. And acting with the certainty that God does the rest can in and of itself be a revolutionary act. Because that is not the norm. Shalom means so much more than peace. It comes from the Hebrew root shalom that means to be safe or complete. And by implication to also be friendly or reciprocate. Shalom evokes wholeness for both individuals and for entire communities. And shalom, for me, captures this sense that peace is broader than an absence of war. Peace requires that restoration and justice that we see so sorely lacking in our world right now. From Ferguson to Staten Island, back home to LA, and out into the world, shalom is the peace of wholeness and restoration that can be profoundly uncomfortable. It isn't an absence of protest or discord or disagreement, and it isn't a handout. It's a radical transformation of the kind that we commemorate this season when God came to dwell among us, to disrupt social norms, to overthrow conventions, and to show us the realm of God present among us. I'll leave us with the words of Daniel Berrigan, who writes about peace, saying, "Of course, let us have peace, we cry, but at the same time, let us have normalcy. Let us lose nothing. Let our lives stand intact. Let us know neither prison, nor ill repute, nor disruption of ties." There is no peace because there are no peacemakers. There are no makers of peace because the making of peace is at least as costly as the making of war, at least as exigent, at least as disruptive, at least as liable to bring disgrace and prison and even death in its wake. Maybe the key to preparing the way is in our willingness to make ourselves uncomfortable for Christ as we seek God's reign of shalom. I'll invite us into a moment of silent contemplation as we prepare hearts and minds.